Okay, this is what I've got now. I pinned it so that the collar was touching in the middle and those two pieces were overlapping. And you can see that my edge stitching turned out pretty decent right there. And then on one side I've tacked this down by stitching in the ditch on the top side. So I have this side pinned and I'm going to stitch in the ditch again. But I'm going to start up here and come outward so that I know I'm not going to create a bubble for myself going the other direction. But I want to make sure I have it lined up so that the stitching lines are right on top of each other. And that will help hold the facing in place. And they turn out nicer if you clip all your threads. Okay. Sometimes you'll see them hand tacked around, but typically, to see what's in the camera view, typically they would get serged from here around all the way in one pass and then get tacked, but we're skipping that for this little assignment. So now we're ready to put in the armhole facing and the sleeve. So let's see which one goes where. Alright, this is my back. I know it's because it's got two notches. Also the front is more curved. And that's going to be right side in. So that's going to match this side. So I'm going to line that up so the stitches are right on top of each other so that I can stitch in the ditch on that one when I'm through also. Okay, so just like with the sleeve, I want to pin it so that it's going to sew together properly right from the edge. But I'm not going to start sewing here. I'm going to take that pin out eventually. I want to make sure my dart is folded down so that it's in the right place. I'm going to start sewing about an inch away from the edge, so right about here. I want to be able to work with it flat because it's so tiny. And part of me wants to turn off the sewing machine because it's noisy, but then the light would go off with it. So you can see in the back armhole, that armhole facing does not have ease in it, but the armhole itself does. So, like with the other, you want to make sure that's down and pinned so that the ease is even. And because this is a little bit more on the straight of grain, that's going to be a little more tough, but I can do it. Okay. So I'm going to skip the first inch and start sewing right here, right on the edge of the foot. And then I'm going to stop before I get to the end. If you forget to stop before you get to the end, you'll have to unpick that little bit in order for this to work. So now I can turn that inside. But before I do that, I'm going to understitch the part that I've sewn. Well, not quite all the way. I'm going to come back up here another inch and edge stitch from about 2 inches up. Because I can't go all the way around right there. So you don't have to edge stitch. I just find it easier for me. But you're welcome to edge stitch. This time I'm going the other direction, so I can still move the needle position going the other way. Okay, at least on my machine. Well, this machine. I'm making sure I just have those 2 layers of seam allowance down, the facing on top, and I'm pulling it open. But this only works if you're about 1/16 of an inch in from the stitching line. If you get wider than that, it actually puckers the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Okay. I've got the camera in an odd place again, so. Okay, so I've stitched. Here's my collar, my shoulder seam, and my facing is going to fold in now. And before I do anything else with it, I'm going to trim the area where I've edge stitched. Being careful not to trim anything but the seam allowance. Okay, I don't want to trim where I haven't sewn yet because then I won't know how far to sew, but do you see how that relaxed a lot when I trimmed it? It just had too much. That inside circle where because this is curved, the further in the circle goes, the smaller it is, which makes the stitched area tight. So I could also clip that. And while I'm right here, I'm going to fold this over. And line those up exactly, just like I did on the facing on the collar. Putting a pin through from the back. And I'm just going to stitch in the ditch on the shoulder. And I'm starting from the edge and going in to avoid that bubble. And I'm going to double check and make sure that my needle position is in the center again. And this machine is slightly off, so I'm going to move it over a little bit. And if I keep going over my pins like that, they're all going to be bent. But in my defense, I can't move my arms. Very well. Okay, that one I did pretty good. You can't even see it on the outside. And that will help keep the facing in. Otherwise they pop out. Okay, so the tricky part of this, we haven't sewn the underarm because we want it to look like it was sewn in the round. So I'm going to turn it right sides together, and I'm going to line up the side seam. Well, I'm going to do the sleeve first, but when I get to this, the side seam will be lined up. And then I'm going to take the underarm of the facing separately and line it up, and I'm going to stitch the side seam portion of the armhole facing and the side seam of that piece of the side seam below the armhole facing. So that's what I will do with it. Now, can I sew the other side if I stitch that together already? Yes, I think I can. So we're going to go ahead and finish this. So turn it inside out or right side in. I've taken that little under bit of facing right there and pinned the side seam together of the facing. So I'm going to stitch that. And as you're listening to the video, I would listen to it as fast as you can understand it because I talk slower. I talk at the speed of my hands, which can be really annoying to listen to. And I got that caught in there. And then you can pause it and replay if there's something that you didn't catch. Okay, so what that did was complete the circle of the facing. Does that make sense? The facing is a full circle now. And if it was confusing to do that first, you can wait to do that until the end. But this is a full circle. And now we're going to make the side seam a full circle. Now, obviously, it's better to sew it in the round. So practice that. But this is very helpful in this type of situation. Okay. Trimming my threads. Now I've also got more threads. I sewed my side seam and I sewed the underarm seam, but I still have to keep it inside out because now I just have this last little bit to sew. So when I turn it out the other way, you can see we've got side seam sewn, facing side seam sewn, and we're going to put them right sides together right there. And I could press them both open or press each of them opposite directions. But I'm lining those up carefully so that they match exactly. I'll put a pin in the seam allowance so it stays open on both sides. And then I just have this last little bit to stitch, and it's difficult to stitch that tiny little piece. I can't do it from that side, so I'm gonna turn mine so that the facing is down and the side seam is up, and I'm just gonna do that last little bit. So I'm picking it up in the stitching where I ended before, and I'm lining it up exactly. And I just need to stitch over to right there where I can connect with the other one. And the sleeve is going to be the same way. It'll just be a sleeve instead of an armhole facing. Okay, so I didn't edge stitch all the way. I could maybe, now that it's stitched, if it was a full scale item, I would be able to get in there and do that, but I'm not going to try. I am, once I've checked it and made sure that I don't have any little mistakes right there, and I do have a little messy spot. But it's just where I stitched past, so I'm going to clip that where I stitched outside of the circle. So now that will lay smoothly. And if I hadn't caught the stitch on the inside, then I would need to stitch over that again from the inside. But that looks okay. Alright, so I can trim. I can pick up where I left off trimming. And I'm going to trim that down to 1/8 of an inch. And we could have patterned it at 1/8 of an inch, but I wouldn't have wanted to try and sew it, so we patterned it for 1/4 of an inch, and we're trimming. So I'm going to turn that back under. I could pause and press right now, but I can turn that under and inside and just top stitch, no, stitch in the ditch like I did on the shoulder. But you have to smooth it out really carefully so that it looks nice. So now the facing is going to be inside, and I can go press it now. Stitch in the ditch.